Part 1. The Left. Dialectically informed Marxism. A review of the left is made necessary by the need to properly define the object of this analysis. Many of the current assumptions used to frame the left assume today's players to be unique and disassociated from historical events that may otherwise define them. The decision to limit our understanding to the current tactical environment with the current lexicon, to the here and now, players and agendas, disassociates the left from the operational sequencing, strategic design, and historical continuity that puts them in frame. It's disconnected. This is not an accident. Limiting our awareness of the left assures our action-reaction responses will be chronically under-inclusive to the strategies driving the left's operational design and sequencing. The dialectic and the left. The commanding heights from which to understand the left demands the ability to visualize the role of the dialectic in driving left-thinking ideologies, strategies, and worldviews. It is only from this vantage that one can foreseeably recognize the left as it progresses through its rivers, tributaries, currents, and streams. There is no understanding the left outside a recognition that it is dialectically informed and driven. The dialectic is not only the operating system of the left, but also that of many united front groups that predictably come into play when the left puts its schemes into motion. As the dominant dialectical player, just as with the pull from a vortex, the left causes lesser players to fold in when united fronts are pulsed to execute lines of effort. Platonically speaking, the Hegelian dialectic is the archetype form. In political warfare, it's the arch inflection point on which Western civilization shifts on its axis. The dialectic, regardless of how the left rebrands and repackages it, remains the engine of the left. Marx acknowledged this when stripping the Hegelian dialectic of its esoteric strangeness when rebranding it as dialectical materialism. Quote, "With Hegel, the dialectic is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell." Unquote. Karl Marx. But the source code of Marxism remains Hegelian. Quote, "The famous turning upside down proclaimed by Engels itself invites us to do so. Hegel turned upside down and put back on his feet is still Hegel." Unquote. Jacques Maritain. So central is Hegel to the understanding the left that the rigorous Marxist Internet Archive is committed to educating its readers on Hegel, making it clear that it is Hegel's dialectic that gives Marxism the excitement and exuberance that makes it a peer competitor to the Judeo-Christian ethos in Judeo-Christian cultures. From the Marxist Internet Archive's Hegel for Beginners, quote, "Reading Hegel gives one a sense that the movement of thought will coincide with the vision of harmony that awaits us at the end of the whole process. Every serious reader of Hegel can bear witness to the intoxication of such moments." Unquote. The dialectic infuses dialectically driven organizations with an ideological zeal that Bella Dodd equated with religion when testifying to the House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1953. Dr. Dodd, quote, "Communism is like a religion. President Eisenhower said that the other day, but it is a religion without a God. If you believe strongly in communism, it is your duty to bring it into every phase of your life. Communism is a way of life, and it is almost like a religion. It becomes a part of you. It affects your entire thinking. It affects your attitude towards your students, toward your government, affects your attitude towards things that are happening day by day. Most communist college professors begin by being very much interested in their students, and if they have a communist philosophy, they pass it on." Unquote. Because the left operates along dialectical lines, it is perilous to analyze its trajectory and objectives as if they were not determined that way. The left does not mirror image expectations based on non-left perspectives. Yet, because there is a tendency to mirror image the left, the dialectic remains opaque, even among those in continuous confrontation with it. The left enforces its objectives through narratives. To ensure conformance, narratives simply need to be constructed so that it is easier for people to comply than to not. The left is under no obligation to inform target audiences that they are the targets of narratives designed to garner compliance and conformity. As these narratives penetrate into societal leadership groups, they become the passive basis on which controlled oppositions are structured. This is why, from Dodd to Bezmenov, the focus has always been on penetrating and influencing elite political and power circles. Just as not all dialectical constructs are on the left, not all elements of the left are Marxist, and not all those who implement leftist objectives are aware of the role they play. But as the dominant construct most committed to the dialectic, the left resonates the strongest and, hence, draws others into its vortex, so that they will either, over time, be co-opted and discarded, or be drawn into the left through the dialectical process of negation that Hegel called Aufheben. It is through united fronts that dialectically driven entities are pulled into the left's orbit and made to conform. Dialogue, praxis, contradictions, third ways, third waves, etc. Because the left is the dominant dialectic of our time, however, even conservative dialectical movements will ultimately fold in by positioning conservative positions so that the dominant dialectic simply negates them. For these reasons, a review of certain aspects of the Hegelian dialectic is in order. On first impression, some aspects may seem tangential and even a bit strange. As the explanation continues, it will be shown that the tangential and strange have a way of coming into play in unexpected ways. To counter the left, it is important to anticipate its movements. The left moves dialectically, through time, and on a trajectory. To make the unexpected foreseeable, it is critical to understand how the dialectic moves. All roads lead to Hegel. Quote, "The speculative systems of the Comtean, Hegelian, and Marxian type, favored today as alternatives, are not science, but deformations of the life or reason through the magic practice of self-divination and self-salvation." Unquote. Eric Voegelin, 1971. From the time he stepped out of his lecture hall in Jena in 1806 to gaze upon Napoleon, seeing in him as a living manifestation of the universal merged with the particular and the individual, Hegel took it upon himself to form a new Volksreligion around which a unifying German people could form a nation-state, believing as he did that the Orientalism of Christianity had deprived Germany of its true metaphysic. In this new Volksreligion, metaphysic, cosmology, or theosophy may be better terms, Hegel identified the state as God bestriding the land. In keeping with this view, Hegel imbued the state with godlike attributes, claiming for it a supreme right over the individual. When fully actualized, such a state is to be led by men of action, vested with the zeitgeist of the times that allows them to transcend conventional law and morality. Hegel's archetype man of action was Napoleon. Hegel's concept of the nation-state is intensely statist. Think statism. Benedict Viviano made the connection between Hegel and the statist nature of World War I, a war that leveled the playing field for the left. Quote, "In its classic form, Hegel's philosophy of history concludes that Prussia is the present and permanent incarnation of the Holy Spirit, and that it is God's will that Prussia should conquer and govern the world, or so was understood. Such an understanding led to the First World War." Unquote. Viviano's views of the Prussian state's relationship to the Hegelian cosmology is not unique. A year after the second brutal war with the realized Prussian state in his lifetime, Bertrand Russell, the famous English philosopher, likewise recognized the role of the absolute idea in Hegel's realized Prussian state. While maybe not obvious, political analysis requires that we recognize the role of Hegel's concept of the Holy Spirit in the context of the dialectic. As will be discussed, Hegel's Holy Spirit arises out of his philosophy of the Spirit and conforms to his Geist. Understood in the political context in which Hegel wrote, the dialectic justifies doctrines as it establishes them. Eric Voegelin recognized the drive underlying the dialectic and labeled it a libido dominandi, a will to power, using language that resonated Pieper's pseudo-reality. Recognizing the statism behind Hegel's vision of a new Teutonic cosmology, while at the same time understanding the interplay of Hegel's men of action, God, and the state, one begins to recognize the archetype form, the template, of modern authoritarian rule and governance that demands absolute fidelity to the Hegelian state and its leaders. In Germany, a certain man of action would lead a master race of Aryans to a 1,000-year Reich, culminating in Hitler's triumph of power along Hegelian lines, consistent with Vogelin's libido dominandi, the will to power. In Russia, the new Soviet man propelled Lenin and Stalin to men of action status. From Castro, the model devolved to Hugo Chavez and his ruination of Venezuela. And then there is the Francis fiasco. Scientism, a hallmark of the dialectic, a weapon of the left. Because Hegel built his religion on his speculative system of science, challenging it means defying science. Think scientism. Hegel believed that empirically based research, based on the scientific method, the modern definition of science, rests at the lowest level of science, representing a base form of thought he labeled understanding. To Hegel, science, at the level of understanding, is external, mechanistic, and serves only to fix characters in their distinctness in anticipation of a dialectical turn reflecting a higher level knowledge he identified as reason. As an a priori concept, Hegel's higher level science is antithetical to modern concepts of science. There are consequences when science, as reason, is positioned to enjoy the status of science as the term is commonly understood today. For Hegel, science is his philosophy. For example, the full title of the Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, is System of Science, first part, the Phenomenology of Spirit. Another example can be found in Hegel's Science of Logic. Borrowing from Kant, reason, quote, is the faculty that strives to go beyond the understanding by attempting to effect higher-level synthesis of knowledge, unquote. As such, for Hegel, and for dialectically driven ideologies generally, science does not necessarily mean science as the term is used today. In fact, Hegel's higher science can mean the scientizing of competing a priori claims used to establish competing worldviews that may otherwise completely fail to meet scientific claims based on the scientific method. As Bertrand Russell made clear, Hegel's logic is his metaphysic. The German term for science is Wissenschaft, which, especially in Hegel's time, more broadly meant knowledge. Even in English, science did not carry the exclusive quote-unquote scientific method understanding that it brings with it today. While it is true that Wissenschaft can more loosely mean, quote, any attempt to understand some aspect of existence in a manner that is rational, systematic, and methodical, unquote, it is also reasonably clear that the distinction between knowledge and scientific knowledge has been intentionally blurred from the beginning. This was done by those, including Hegel himself, who sought to impose a metaphysic, i.e., a competing worldview, as if it carried the attributes of a science. This is all the more true in the English-speaking world, where today, quote-unquote, science has taken on an exclusive meaning separate from other forms of knowledge. Eric Voegelin recognized the alchemy in Hegel's Wissenschaft, labeled it sorcery, and exposed it. Quote, "The third stratum is the imaginative construction of ages that will permit the imaginator to anticipate the future course of history. By means of this construction, the imaginator can shift the meaning of existence from life in the presence under God, with its personal and social duties of the day, to the role of a functionary of history. The reality of existence will be eclipsed and replaced by the second reality of the imaginative project. In order to fulfill this purpose, Hegel's project must first of all eclipse the unknown future by the image of a known future. It must further endow the construction of the ages with the certainty of a science, of a Wissenschaftler, a system of science, a philosophy positive, a Wissenschaftler Sozialismus, and it must, finally, conceive the future age in such a manner that the present imaginator becomes its inaugurator and master. The purpose of securing a meaning of existence with certainty in a masterly role betrays the motives of the construction in the imaginator's existential insecurity, anxiety, and libido dominante. This is megalomania on the grand scale." Unquote. For Voegelin, the sorcerer is the imaginator who first creates and then imposes a false second reality. This is in line with Joseph Pieper's constructed pseudo-reality. Bertrand Russell held the same jaundiced view of Hegel's schema. Quote, "Philosophers have professed to discover a formula of progress showing that the world was becoming gradually more and more to their liking. The recipe for a philosophy of this type is simple. The philosopher first decides which are the features of the existing world that give him pleasure, and which are the features that give him pain. He then, by a careful selection among facts, persuades himself that the universe is subject to a general law leading to an increase of what he finds pleasant and a decrease in what he finds unpleasant. Next, having formulated his law of progress, he turns on the public and says, 'It is fated that the world must develop as I say. Therefore, those who wish to be on the winning side and do not care to wage fruitless war against the inevitable will join my party. Those who oppose him are condemned as unphilosophic, unscientific, and out of date, while those who agree with him feel assured of victory, since the universe is on their side. At the same time, the winning side, for reasons which remain somewhat obscure, is presented as the side of virtue. The man who first fully developed this point of view was Hegel. Hegel's philosophy is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane men to accept it, but he did. He set it out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. It can easily be expounded lucidly in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious." Unquote. Arthur Schopenhauer was the first to associate pseudo with Hegel's philosophy when, in 1840, the German contemporary, philosopher, and critic decried, quote, "Now if for this purpose I were to say that the so-called philosophy of this fellow Hegel is a colossal piece of mystification which will yet provide posterity with an inexhaustible theme for laughter at our times, that it is a pseudo-philosophy, paralyzing all mental powers, stifling all real thinking, and by the most outrageous misuse of language, putting in its place the hollowest, most senseless, thoughtless, and as is confirmed by its success, most stupefying verbiage. I should be quite right." Unquote. One suspects that Marx fully grasped Schopenhauer while also recognizing the power of Voegelin's imaginator for the person in control of such a dialectic. To gain the upper hand against his less astute opposition, all Marx had to do was designate his program Wissenschaft Sozialismus, or scientific socialism, define it as a scientific certainty, and declare it inevitable. As Russell explained, scientism comes into play when the language of science is used to reify, to the point of enforcement, metaphysical claims as if established scientific facts. It fosters a sense of scientific certainty on the one side, while positioning the opposition as unscientific dullards to be looked down upon and replaced. With an eye towards scientism, there is a difference between the scientific theory of evolution and the alchemical political Darwinism, the physics of complexity theory and the alchemical complexity theory, which, as an institutionalized metaphysic, is imposed on analysis and decision-making within the government apparatus that becomes more pervasive the higher up one goes. Complexity is a narrative designed to make all knowledge seem gnostically unknowable to the uninitiated. It's complicated. Of course, the world is so complex, all one can do is manage chaos. There are the environmental sciences and climatology, and then there are their pseudoscience one-offs that distinguish themselves by heightened demands for statist intervention. Using complexity theory as an example, it is an institutionalized logic attack embedded within the analytical architecture of national security that effectively reduces analytical products to an imbecilic level of incoherence. It is intentional. It accomplishes this by imposing the Hegelian demand to require knowledge of the whole as a condition of having knowledge of the particular. This makes it, quote-unquote, complicated. One need only sit in a counterterror or related national security briefing, or listen to associated congressional testimony, or read Islamic movement text written for non-Muslims while playing buzzword bingo with terms and phrases like, quote, "The world is so complex, all we can do is manage chaos," unquote, and, quote, "It's complicated," unquote, or, quote, "We have to build the plane while we fly it," unquote. Just think about that one, with others to get a sense for how deeply institutionalized this logic bomb has embedded. But, as Bertrand Russell explained, quote, "If knowledge were knowledge of the universe as a whole, there would be no knowledge," unquote. The vacancy of our national security analysis, along with an institutional preference for it, is a conditioned outcome that benefits someone other than us. Concern for the debilitating role complexity theory plays in the counter-terror analytical workspace is not new. As early as 2010, the issue was raised in the paper The Killing Without Right, Islamic Concepts of Terrorism. In 2015, Catastrophic Failure, Blindfolding America in Face of Jihad, took direct aim at the havoc complexity theory wreaked on counter-terror analysis. Appendix A demonstrates how Russell's explanation of the Hegelian dialectics demand that all particulars be understood exclusively in terms of the whole, likewise explains the subversive nature complexity theory plays on national security analysis. This assessment of Hegel is not simply an arcane philosophical curiosity. For example, for a nation organized around the belief in rights endowed by the Creator, if this analysis holds up, the transition to a dialectically determined worldview would necessarily be associated with a transition from rights endowed by the Creator to Hegel's privileges granted by the state, by operation of that transition. If this occurs, one would expect to find a man of action instituting a Hegelian state complete with statist objectives and scientized rationales. Enter Woodrow Wilson. Because Woodrow Wilson's politics were progressive, his treatment is out of the order of this paper. He is included at this point because his political program can be explained exclusively in Hegelian terms. As the discussion of the science of understanding suggests, Hegel had a low opinion of scientists in the emerging scientific fields, most especially Sir Isaac Newton. Hegel believed Newton's science to be a mechanistic understanding of science, a base example of the physics of understanding. Further, Hegel believed Newtonian science depicted a, quote, dead, mechanical system of externally related entities, unquote. Woodrow Wilson infamously shared Hegel's view of the Newtonian sciences, believing the U.S. Constitution to be a manifestation of the inferior science of understanding that rendered it in dire need of being progressed, or, more accurately, negated. In his famous homage to Hegel, at least for those with a discerning ear, Wilson prominently signaled the Hegelian nature of his agenda in the stump speeches he gave in 1912. Quote, "The Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its task, shaped by the sheer pressure of life." Unquote. As John Marini attests, quote, "Wilson's view becomes intelligible in light of Hegel's doctrine." Unquote. Ronald Prestrito states that, quote, "By far the most important direction in which Wilson's thought developed was in its adoption of Hegelianism." Unquote. Certainly, as Bertrand Russell observed, Hegel's was the dominant philosophy among American professors at the turn of the 19th century, when Wilson was a professor. Realizing that Hegel, quote, "saw the world as a cosmos, an internally related organic whole," unquote, and that the Hegelian metaphysic was often expressed in terms of cultural Darwinism in the English-speaking world, Wilson's preference for Darwinian science was ominous, especially when contrasted with Newton. In transitioning America to a Hegelian state, a long-term dialectical negation of the Bill of Rights would quietly position the rights endowed by the Creator thesis against privileges granted by the state antithesis, in recognition that the unfolding Wilsonian state would become, quote, "the divine idea as it exists on earth," unquote, i.e., God, at least in the Hegelian schema. Beginning with Wilson, individual rights that exist before the state and ahead of the state would be pitted against group rights conferred as state privileges in an ongoing series of negations. In the dialectical process of negation, privileges granted by the state are made antithetical to rights endowed by a creator. And make no mistake, this was the Wilsonian gambit. As Russell pointed out, quote, "The real question we have to ask in connection with Hegel is whether the state is good per se, as an end. Do the citizens exist for the sake of the state, or the state for the sake of the citizens? Hegel holds the former view. The liberal philosophy that comes from Locke holds the latter." Unquote. From a Hegelian perspective, Wilson was a man of action who initiated the transformation of the federal government into a statist entity relying on scientized rationales. Barely recognized to this day, the Constitution has yet to recover. It's not just that group rights are nowhere to be found in the Bill of Rights, it's that they exist to negate those rights secured in it.